I saw some things.
I could be found out at any moment.
Oh, I was so cold.
I kind of like that.
I never really stuck to the plan.
Your mistakes.
Reality is way more complex than all of this.
You don't even realise how afraid you are.
Sort of terrible and magical.
Oh, you never forget it, mate.
And
it was perfect.
Conversations with Sarah Konoski on ABC Radio.
Joshua Creamer is a barrister. He specialises in human rights and native title cases. Josh is a Wanyi Kalkadoon man, one of only a handful of First Nation barristers in Australia. A few years ago, Josh had the honour of being part of the ceremony where his mum, Sandra Creamer, was also admitted as a lawyer into Queensland's Supreme Court. Both Josh and his mum have gone through more than most on the way to realise their ambitions. And a heads up, Josh's story includes domestic violence and suicide. It was following a recent family tragedy that Josh knew he himself was close to falling apart. So he set off to take stock all the way to Mount Everest. Hi, Josh.
How are you, Sarah?
Very well. It's lovely to have you on the program. As I say, you're a Wanyi and Kalkadoon man. What part of the country do you belong to?
Kalkadoon country's around Mount Isa, and that's where I grew up, and the Wanyi country's around the Gulf of Carpentaria, and in particular, Lawn Hill near Doomadgee is an important place for my family.
And when you close your eyes and think about what that part of Australia looks like, what comes to mind?
Those rocky hills around Mount Isa, and sometimes it's quite dry and arid, and there's some really magical waterholes. There's a little place called Spring Creek where my mother used to take us swimming out past the airport. That's one. There's Lake Mundara out there, but there's a nice waterhole on the way to Cloncurry too. I went swimming, and I swear the place put a curse on me when I was there. But
what do you mean?
Oh, it just really imbued some magical feelings in you while you were there, and it's a place that you can't forget. I still get to travel to Mount Isa quite regularly, and it's beautiful country, and it's just a special part of the world.
This is where your mum's people are from. What do you know about her early life, Josh?
My mother had a really tough life. She was the youngest of 12, so we have a big family, and in Mount Isa we are literally related to everybody. But she was the youngest of 12, and her mother passed away when my mum would have been about 6 months old from cancer. So she was raised by one of her older sisters and a few of her aunties and uncles, and my grandfather, he was a cook out on stations, cattle stations. And so he'd be out working, and then the kids would look after themselves, and they had the aunties and uncles around, and that was my mother's life as a young child growing up.
You spent your early years in Mount Isa. What are your memories of what things were like at home when you were a kid there?
It's tough that in a lot of times you can only remember the really tough and difficult occasions, and my stepfather and my mother were living in a domestic and family violent relationship. And I was only young. I was only primary school when I left Mount Isa, started grade 8. And so the most I remember is really the physical violence. If you look back today, you'd probably say, well, there's coercive control and there's other elements to it. But, I remember my mother, she's only small. She was probably 45 kilos, about half the size of me. And my stepfather's a big man. I remember her being up against the wall and being physically assaulted by him, and that was tough as a kid. I also copped it too, I think, as the oldest, and I got hit a few times, and that was the circumstance in which we lived under. It was a tough environment for all of us.
What do you remember about the lead up to your mum's decision to leave and take your kids away from that?
I mean, it must have been really tough for her. I remember getting married, and I was set at my wedding day. I'm 30 years old, and my mother was this age, and she left with 3 kids in Mount Isa. We moved to Yeppoon in central Queensland.
Yeppoon's a little town on the coast of central Queensland. How different was it to Mount Isa?
It couldn't be any more different. You've got northwest Queensland, Stockman, and these cattle stations, all these Indigenous young fellas running around. And then you move to Yeppoon, and when I first got there, I thought, well, is this a retirement village? I didn't see any black people, firstly.
Didn't see anyone at the 60s.
No, exactly. And I was like, what is going on here? So, there's a general demographics which is different, but I mean, it's a beautiful coastline, and that Capricorn Coast part of Australia is something really special, and that became our home. My mother sort of worked our way up. We met people, we developed friendships, and that served us really well in those early stages.
What state was your mum in, though, Josh, in those early months of coming out of such a damaging relationship?
Look, I think that all of us had PTSD, and to tell you the truth, I think we all still have it to some level, PTSD from that time. And I know it took a long time, and I don't know if my mother's ever fully recovered, but I know it took a number of years for her to even just be able to function on a normal level. I was the oldest. I was probably about 12 or 13, and my younger sister was maybe 11 years old, and then my other brother, he was about 8, and my other brother was born later. But I remember we were living in a house together in Yeppoon, and we were just like shadows. You know, I sort of thought at the time, just thinking we're almost like roommates in that, you know, there's not much of a bond to bring us together. We barely sort of communicate with each other. We are individually self-sufficient, and I think my siblings, the oldest of us, all felt like we've raised ourselves from an early age. And, you know, whilst my mother was present, you know, in a physical sense, we developed our own identities and independence really early, and that was tough. And I just remember thinking, you know, there's a group of shadows walking around here in the house. We're barely existing in a sense, you know, that sense you feel in your heart, that having a really strong soul and an identity and just being really emotionally stable and comfortable. We didn't have that as kids.
I'm imagining you would have carried a lot of that fear with you too, although you weren't living with this violent man. That's what you'd grown up expecting. It must have not been easy to get used to the fact that you weren't under threat in the same way.
There was that, but I think the hardest thing was actually being thrust into the role as thinking you're a father at 12 and 13 years old. And I think back now, and I tried to play that role and, you know, to be supportive of my mother and help my younger siblings. And, you know, I would have made so many mistakes. I did make so many mistakes, but that is the toughest thing, I think, actually being thrust into that position and then having that responsibility. And that's something I had, you know, as a 12, 13-year-old.
How tough were things financially at that point?
Oh, look, we didn't have any money. My mother still hasn't really ever had much interest in money and accumulating wealth or property. You know, there'd be a struggle to keep the electricity on. The phone would be turned off a few times. I remember going down to the phone box. I must have been a teenager and trying to get the phone hooked up in my name. So, I mean, that was just part and parcel of it. You didn't really need money to do things, and that was really the circumstance. It was tough on my mother, but, you know, it was tough on us kids, but it is what it is.
When you were a teenager, your brother Robson was born. How did the house change once this little baby arrived?
Yeah, Robson was really special. So he was born in Yeppoon. I was 15 years old, so I was in grade 10 actually at the time, or getting close to grade 11. And he came along, and I think for the first time we were allowed to have some emotion. We were actually allowed to love something and care for something, and we did. You know, I know my sister and I, something we talk about really fondly. And, you know, I was like a father to him. My sister was like a mother to him from those teenage years. And that was just something really special. I think it took us out of that space we had been for a number of years. And for the first time, we'd had some warmth and emotion and caring in the house, and that's not something that is familiar or common for us, and that's what he brought. He brought a real ray of sunshine to our lives.
What about life outside of the family, Josh? What was school like for you?
Look, I was really lucky. Mum was always insistent on getting us a good education, and the Christian Brothers in Yeppoon let me go to school there, and she was able to pay it off. And, you know, I don't think it's difficult because, you know, you go to these high schools and the teachers really never understand your history and the experience you're going through, and you know, they expect you to sit there and conform and to do all those things. And for the most part I did, but I never had much of a focus on, you know, academia and those things. And I was grade 10, I started working after school in a butcher shop, and that was really a big change for me actually, because first, it gave me a little bit of money, which I could help out at home, gave me some additional responsibility, but it also gave me an identity outside of the family and outside of being a school kid. And so, you know, instead of, you know, dressing up in your school uniform or being at home and having the expectations on you, I was, you know, working with a group of men in a butcher shop, and I was just doing my own thing. It was actually a really fundamental change in sort of my early years as a young kid.
And did you think back then that might be your future, that you'd finish your apprenticeship as a butcher and take that on as a job?
Certainly, the school asked me to leave in grade 10. I'm glad I didn't.
Can you tell me why?
Well, they said, you've got a job at the butcher shop, you should leave and not come back. And it wasn't, it wasn't like I was in trouble all the time. I just think they thought that was a better fit for me, being an Indigenous boy. But I did think I'd go on and complete an apprenticeship. And after 3 years working there, grade 10, 11 and 12 after school, I did start an apprenticeship after that. And I always say it's one of those jobs where the job was available for 6 weeks while the apprentice was at TAFE in Brisbane, and 6 years later I left the place.
Are you still in charge of the barbecues and meat cutting at your home?
Oh, I can still pick a good steak, I can tell you that.
So how did you go from working in a butcher shop in Yeppoon to studying law?
It's interesting when you grow up in a regional area, and there's very few opportunities. And I always think that the ones who get ahead are the people who take whatever opportunities that came up. I didn't think I'd be a butcher forever, but I knew there was a job when I was young, and that $62.50 I was earning a week would make a big difference at home. And then after I finished, then I understood an apprenticeship was available, and it's something I wanted to do. I agreed to do it, and if I make a commitment, I'll stick to it. But I knew early on in my apprenticeship I wouldn't stay there forever, and I was looking at, I always had this interest in politics and social justice and law and, all these issues which my mates going to school were more concerned about footy and those types of things. So there was a whole world out there I wanted to explore, and I knew once I got through my trade I'd go out and do that. And actually, I wanted to go and work in the mines because Century Zinc was then one of the biggest zinc mines in the world out on Wanya country, and I thought I'd go and work in the mines because all my family had worked in the mines, and I actually wrote a letter to the Indigenous employer out there, but I didn't hear back from them. My girlfriend at the time was going to uni on the Gold Coast, and I thought, yeah, I'll give it a go. So that's where I ended up. You did take some time off to go and work out in the mines. What was that like? Yeah, well, I've got mining in the blood, and I did want to give it a try, Sarah. That it's something, I grew up with it, and being in Mount Isa, it is a mining town. Well, I guess it's a mine with a small town next to it. But I went out and I worked underground in coal mines for about 6 months. And I thought about it in the context, if I never finish uni, then this is probably the best, highest paid job I could get. And I went out there and I realised pretty quickly, get me back on the books. So,
What's a bit easier, is it, studying law than working underground?
Look, I end up working by myself on the belts, and you're literally underground by yourself 10, 12 hours a day. You don't see anyone. And but there's also, I like the intellectual challenge, and that really, I wasn't getting that, but also the work wasn't particularly personally rewarding. And I had a glimpse of law school, and I had a glimpse of what the legal profession looked like, and I thought I'm probably a better fit than I am a coal miner.
When did you first become aware of Cara, the woman who would become your wife eventually?
Yeah, well, that was back in Yeppoon as well. So I was doing my apprenticeship then, and at various times in my life I've had a photographic memory, but now I've sort of read too much stuff on the news and it just clocks up my brain. But I remember reading an article about Cara, and Yeppoon is a bit like the old Sea Change show, and I'm not sure plenty of your listeners will remember Sea Change. Beautiful little coastal town, Mayor Bob Jelly, all this sort of stuff. And Yeppoon would have a pineapple fest every year. So, look, it's big because we have our parades and we have the pineapple queens, and Cara was an entrant. So she was about 17, 18 years old, and she was an entrant. I think she might have been 17. And I was sitting in the butcher shop. I remember sitting out the chair on this big stainless steel table and reading the local free paper, which was the Mirror at the time. And Cara was being profiled as an entrant. And what stuck in my mind was she wanted to be a lawyer in the Navy. And by that time, I obviously thought I wanted to study law as well. So that was my exposure to her. And was
that the only thing that stuck in your mind, Josh?
Yeah, look, it really was actually. Cara was going to, I think, the all-girls school at the time, and but it just stuck out. And I remember having a conversation with my boss about her wanting to be a lawyer in the Navy. And fast forward 4 years, so I don't see this girl, talk to her. Fast forward 4 years, I'm back in Yeppoon, and I see her out one night, and I go and talk to her, and I say, do you still want to be a lawyer in the Navy?
Get out.
And I'm studying law by then, so...
Oh, it's smooth creamer.
That's how it all happens, right?
Was she taken aback?
She was. She thought she probably thought a range of things. But coincidentally then, she gets home that night and says, yeah, I do want to be a lawyer in the Navy, to herself, enrolls in law school and starts at JCU a couple of weeks later.
Wow. So it might have felt like it was fated to be the two of you, do you think?
Yeah, well, we've been together 20 years now, so there's something that, it was pretty special. And, growing up in a small town again, I mean, she's a superstar, and to have met a woman like her in Yeppoon and seeing what she's achieved is pretty special.
Did she win Miss Pineapple?
No. A little bit of controversy around that. She says
she was robbed.
She was robbed. She was the youngest entrant, but I think she was the fundraising queen instead of the actual pineapple queen. But look, I think that still has a few issues. So maybe when they do a Golden Oldies one in 10 years time, she can run for that.
You have 3 young kids together. How does that, the responsibilities of that, fit in with your life as a lawyer?
I'm busy as a lawyer, and I travel across the country working on the stolen wages and stolen generation and the Palm Island case and all these big cases. But my life, I think, and my busyness is really nowhere near Cara. She's done extraordinary things. She's worked at Women's Legal Service. She started the first domestic violence law firm in Australia. She's been a local politician for 5 or 6 years, and now she started working in a not-for-profit legal centre. But we've both been busy, and I think one of the things is we both make a contribution at home. And at the moment, we don't do it with any nannies or anything like that either. So, no, when you really find a good partner in life, you understand it's those values that keep you together, bring you together and keep you together. And family is important for both of us, and also trying to ensure that both of us can, achieve our career aspirations. And so we contribute where we can at home to make it happen.
What are you teaching your kids, Josh, about their Aboriginal heritage?
Well, it's funny. I mean, I not only have to teach my kids, I go into the daycare and I teach them, and I go to the schools and I teach them. And no, I think the one defining factor that really helped me along was having a strong sense of your own identity. And, there's a lot of cultural mix in our house. Cara's mother's Lebanese, and, my father's from the West Indies, and back on the Aboriginal side, we've got the Chinese that come in from the gold rush as well. But certainly being Indigenous is front and centre. And I talk to my kids about things like stolen generation, stolen wages in a child-focused way. So they understand the history. And my daughter Eden, who's the oldest, has really picked up on that. But it's important for them, I think, to know their history and have a strong sense of their identity. And that's what we're trying to do.
I think about what you described about what life was like at home for you growing up. You didn't have a dad that you can take as a role model. How have you created the kind of father that you want to be to your own kids, given that you didn't have a first-hand experience of that?
Yeah, I know that when I was in the early stages of my career, I did look for people who'd be good role models. And even as a butcher, I think my boss, Peter Morton, was a great role model, and he was a father figure. And I started working for him when I was 13, 14 years old, so he was really important. And as I started in law, people like Chris and I was able to work for Chris, and I did look for that. But Cara's mother and father, they've been together for a long time, and they've got 3 kids, and I think her father is he's probably been the one rock out of everybody, who's always been there and reliable, and he never gets worried about things. He's got a really, really great temperament, actually, and I've probably spent more time with him than any other male over the last 2 decades. So, that's something, but it's a challenge. It's not, I don't find it easy being a father. I don't have a lot of tolerance for kids screaming and jumping around and fighting all the time. And you do have to take a step back. I certainly do have to take a step back every now and then. And, it's a hard journey, but I always think kids are born perfect and their parents stuff them up. And so, I just don't want to do that to my kids.
You've mentioned that a lot of the work that you do as a barrister was on stolen wages.
Yeah, I've worked on the stolen wages in Queensland. I'm still working on stolen wages, WA and Northern Territory. But in across all jurisdictions, so all states and territories, there was laws in place from the early 1900s right up into the 1970s where Aboriginal people worked. In Queensland they worked. They were sent down to different private employers on cattle stations or women as domestics. And rather than their wage being paid to them directly, their wages was paid to government. And government kept those wages. In the Territory in WA, it's more akin to slavery. People just would walk out of the desert in the 60s and 70s and before that, and they'd go and work on a cattle station for 10 years for rations, salt, flour, sugar, tea, tobacco. But I've had a real privilege over the last 7 years, I think, working on those matters. And I just say my job is always, I just travel around Australia and I get to talk to elders. And I've learned so much of our history that I hope as this country moves to truth-telling that everybody starts to understand. But there's so many powerful stories and identities and just a strength and resilience that comes from our history that even young Indigenous kids running around today don't know. And I've probably met with thousands, but I know I've conducted hundreds of interviews that I've recorded, whether it's people up in the Kimberleys or people around Alice Springs out in that area, or people up in the Gulf here in Queensland. I've sat down, I've understood their experiences.
What are some of the stories that have really struck you when you've sat down with elders in those settings?
The brutality of the regime, and there was an incident in Western Australia on one of the government-run missions where, as part of the treatment of people, they rigged up a battery and they'd electrocute the men on the genitals after they'd dress them up in dresses as part of the punishment. And they knew all about it, and you read all the documents and say, yeah, we know, but we need to have the mechanic there, so we're not going to remove him. But the other part, too, I think, which really affected me was the way that women are treated. A lot of assaults, a lot of rapes, sexual assaults, and I just, through my own sort of interviews and understanding, had thought during that period, that probably 100 years, maybe 80% of women would have been affected by that type of conduct. And so that, that always sticks with you because you're sitting down with someone and it just comes out of the blue. They just mention it and it's tough. But, I think the other part of it is understanding that Aboriginal people worked. They worked 14 hours a day, sometimes 52 weeks a year, and they contributed to the development of this country and our nation and the pastoral industry. They supported non-Indigenous women in their homes as domestic cleaners and nursemaids and things, and all that history out there is just it's been forgotten or chosen to be ignored. That's the challenge for us going forward. As
an Indigenous barrister, and there are still only a handful of First Nation barristers in this country, how heavy does the responsibility of telling those stories and seeking justice, how heavily does it sit on your shoulders?
Yeah, I think about my role or my generation in this context and understanding, the law and how it's affected Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people as well, that I think those first generations were really powerless. They lacked any control over their circumstances and then all they could do was strike. And so the 50s, 60s and 70s and even before that you had people, they had no influence over their circumstances but to sit down. That's it. The next generation I think about, their children are probably the marchers. They're the ones marching here through the streets in the 80s against Bjork and others. And my generation, I think we're the influencers. So the ultimate thing is trying to influence the people that make the decisions about us. And because of my role, not only do I learn the stories of the people who've experienced it and get to share that, but I get access to the politicians and the judges and the CEOs and the people who make decisions, and I want to influence their decision making, and I see that as my contribution to tell those stories, to share those stories. And the next generation, my children's generation, well, I hope they are the decision makers, so you don't need the influencers then.
How strange a contrast can it be going from meeting people out in communities in different parts of remote WA or Northern Territory or Queensland and then coming back to your home and your family set up?
Sometimes when I'm away for a long time, and you got to understand that, sometimes you're interviewing people who are living in a shed. They might have worked for 20 years on a station and they've never earned a cent. They live in a shed with no running water, not much bigger than the studio we're in, and actually sometimes half this studio. No running water, no electricity, and they don't know where their next meal's coming from. And I come back to Brisbane, and I'm in sort of living close to the city in a beautiful house that my wife and I built a few years ago. In a world which is so far removed from that, it's hard to really reconcile the two. And I come home and, I'm taking my kids to school or sport and I'm talking to the other parents and I'm just like, is this my reality? Or is my reality out on the road up at Fitzroy Crossing or up at Yundamoo or all these places, these remote places that people, particularly the Aboriginal communities, that people don't get to? You sort of think, how can those two worlds exist at the same time? And for most of us, we never get exposed to that and we judge others by our own circumstances. But I see all of it and I see the struggles of people and I see what they've done. They've made a really significant contribution, but we've just left them out there to I call them the forgotten Australians, to be forgotten.
There are very few Indigenous barristers doing the kind of work you do, and even fewer First Nation women. How are you and Cara trying to change that?
So it's a Joshua Creamer and Cara Cook Excellence in Law Award, and we've partnered with Griffith University to do it. And it's for Indigenous female lawyers towards the end of their law degree with an aspiration of going to the bar. And we set that up about 2 years ago now when I turned 40, and we committed to give financial support. We also mentor and support them into the workplace. It came about because I was working on these matters, thinking I need Indigenous women sitting here next to me, an Indigenous barrister equal to me, if not better, to be able to interview women and to play a lead role in these cases. Like, I saw the need for it on the front line, and I wanted to do something about it. There's only about 20 or so, maybe even a bit less, Indigenous barristers out there. It's such a small pool. And so in that short period of time, we've had two amazing participants come through that program who I know are going to go and change the world, and we're sort of looking forward to what they achieve.
Broadcast, podcast. This is Conversations with Sarah Konoski.
My guest today is barrister Joshua Creamer. Josh is one of only a handful of Indigenous barristers in Australia. And he also made history by formally moving the admission of his mother, Sandra, as a lawyer to the Supreme Court in Queensland. What was that day like, Josh?
Law's got really religious overtones, and that's not. It's got its own language, its own culture, and I don't get nervous in court. I feel like, well, that's my job, but I got nervous that day. I don't think I even dressed myself properly. I had my wig on and my robes.
Wig on backwards.
Yeah, my jabbo was sticking out, and I was like, anyway. And it was during COVID, and I think it was the first time they had a face-to-face swearing in for admission for a while, and it wasn't easy to get admitted. And in much like a religious ceremony, you have to tell them all your sins, and ultimately the judges agree whether or not you should be forgiven. That's the religious overtone of it. And Mum had written lots of affidavits and talked about her experience and all this, and so it took her a while actually to get approved to be admitted. And then I remember saying to her, I was like, Mum, if you don't get it this time, we probably have to think about that's it, maybe do something else. So to go through all that study and not be a lawyer, it would be pretty heartbreaking. But we were there in the ceremony, and I must have been one of the first up. And I get up and I, say, Sandra Creamer, my mother, she's done all the right things. She's complied with all the obligations. And the three judges, they turn and look at each other and they say, let her be admitted. Very much like your sins being forgiven. And I sat down and I was relieved. And I was proud, but also to understand what she's endured, the hardships. And my mother didn't have a lot of wins in her life. To actually have got to that achievement and to now be able to say you're a lawyer and to practice, very special moment for her and for the family, my immediate family, but my whole family as well, her siblings and aunties and uncles too. So
there've been, with your story and your mum's story, these really positive outcomes for your family, but that's not the whole story. Mm. As you got older, what was your relationship like with your youngest brother, with Robson? Did you stay close?
Yeah, well, it was tough because my mother and his father were in a domestic violence relationship as well, right? So the two main relationships, which probably took 25 years of her life, were a lot of domestic violence. And I still don't think I know all of it, but that relationship came to an end. But, Robson we had people thought he was my son, right? I'm 15 years older than him. As he's 4 or 5 years old, I'm 20. I'm a butcher. I'm working in Yeppoon. I'm walking around. This kid's always there next to me and my girlfriend at the time. And so he was my son in a lot of ways. I had that connection with him. And it was tough, as he grew older. And I think, I guess in some ways I started to drift away. I, started my own family and I was doing things down here. And I didn't sort of have that same level of connection and time for him, unfortunately. But it was hard too because I think he saw me, he saw my mother, he saw Cara, and it's like, oh, well, he felt a lot of pressure to go out and be something and to do something that probably wasn't a right fit for him. And so I saw how that relationship changed and how he changed over his life. But probably around the age of 15, he started to have some mental health issues, being subject to the trauma from the DV and the mental health. And I remember he was 15 years old and the school sent him down. He was at boarding school and in Cairns, and he got sent down to me on suicide watch. And I just said to the school at the time, I was like, well, could you have told us beforehand? He had to come down and he's better off in Brisbane with me. It was only a short time, but I just remember the school hadn't said anything beforehand, and then I get this call, he's coming down, and subsequent discussions with the school, and I'm like, well, you should have probably told us this. But it's a real challenge, mental health, and if anyone who's close to it and you've got a family member, you feel, and I still feel, very powerless about it, because as a mental health patient, you've got all the confidentiality attached to it. And I remember asking his doctor at 15, it's like, well, what's going on? Well, I can't tell you. And you sort of think, well, what can I actually do? Unless they're going to sit down and tell you what is happening with them, which Robson never did. All the mental health campaigns, I think, are focused on people who are experiencing it. But there's a lot of us sitting there observing it, saying, how can we help? But I often feel pretty powerless. And it came in at certain points, but even up until the end of last year, Robson became a barber, and if he walked into his barber shop and, he had a beautiful son and he was living his life, he wouldn't know. But sometimes a switch would just turn on him and he'd be completely different. And for us as a family, I guess that was the side I got to see a bit more towards the end.
What happened at Christmas time just last year, Josh, when you went back up to spend time with your family at Yeppoon?
So there'd probably been a 12-month build-up, actually, because the Christmas prior, his partner didn't come around to my mother's house, him and his partner. And that was really strange because Rebecca's an amazing young girl. She's studying law as well, and she's the mother of his child who's 3 years old. And she didn't come around, and I just thought, this is really strange. I ended up contacting her, and she said, look, we had a big argument. I had to call the police, and I've left, and I've gone down to my mother's house, and I think that was a trigger in some way for me, that having seen what my mother went through, the fact that someone, my brother could put his wife through some sort of level of misery, whatever that was, really sort of turned me away from him and turned me more towards her. But that was really the lead up in the 12 months. And then we just hadn't had much conversation or talk, but I would check in with Rebecca to see how everyone's going, and occasionally Robson and I'd have a chat to each other. And you got to contrast with that, us growing up. But then Christmas 2022, my mother got us all together, and it was interesting in that it wasn't a nice Christmas. Usually we all get together and we have a nice time, but it just felt really strained. And I remember the last thing we sort of did that day was the kids had a big water fight, and we got into it. We were doing that as well. And the four of us there, and my sister's a foster mother, so she's got 7 kids and I've got 3 kids, and we usually make a big event of it. But it just wasn't normal Christmas. Felt a bit strained. But the next morning I wake up and it's Boxing Day, so I take the kids to the cinema in Yeppoon. I'm in the cinema and went and seen that Lyle Crocodile. I'll never forget that. And we walk out, and it's 1:30 when I walk out, and I look and I have 3 missed calls from Rebecca, and it's just saying help. I just remember feeling this sort of rush of emotion. I've never received a text like that. Like I say, Cara's worked in domestic violence, and I remember her getting calls at 9, 10 o'clock at night that women were fleeing their homes, but I certainly hadn't experienced that. But Robson and Rebecca had been in an argument. But my sister was there, which is good because she's probably the most calm and coolest and sensible out of all of us. She always has been. And she was talking to Robson in the car, and Rebecca was inside with my sister Tamara, and her partner Katie was inside with Rebecca. And I just stormed in. I parked the car so the kids couldn't see what was going on. I didn't want them to see that, but I stormed in and I was like, that's it. This relationship's over. And I started packing up Rebecca's stuff, and I just said to her, I hate the way you treat this girl, And I said to him, I was like, you ever touch her, I'll kill you. And, I guess in that instance, I felt like I was probably protecting my mum. As a little boy, you grow up, you see these things, there's not much you can do. But when you're an adult and you're in that situation, it's like, well, you know what? No one's going to hurt this woman. I don't care who it is. And so I pack up the stuff and I take her to my place because I had a place in Yeppoon. It's literally right behind my mother's house. So kids are at mum's, car is home. She's talking to Rebecca and she's making a plan, right? I mean, women have these plans that, well, you want to leave a relationship. Kara's putting a plan together on the spot. And my sister's like, no, I'm going to stay with him. I'm a bit worried about him. I'm like, yeah, okay. And I'm sitting at my mother's, or 10 or 15 minutes, I'm sitting at my mother's, and my mother gets a call. And I just remember, I looked at her face and it just shattered into 1,000 pieces. And she couldn't actually say the words, but she said, Robson's dead. I could just hear a slight sound, but I could see her face, her lips moving. So I knew exactly what she said. And we had all the kids at mum's, and I was like, get out here, kids, go, come, Cara, take all these kids, because there was lots of them, all these little cousins, under the age of 5 or 6. And she takes the kids, and I just hammer. I just get in the car and I hammer out to where they are, which is about 10 minutes away from my mother's place on the Capricorn Coast Highway. And you get there, and this is a 2-story house, and I remember so there was one ambulance bus there, but my sister's just leaning up against one of the sort of pylons or the, and she's just she is just crying, howling, you never forget that image, right? She's just sitting there, she's out. And I walk over, because it's actually just behind the fence, where she found him, right? So she finds him. She has to try and keep him going for the ambulance till the ambulance arrives. And I walk over, and there's these 2 ambos there, and it's just behind the front fence, so you can't really see what's going on, which is good from the street. And I think I said, what's going on, or what's happening, or how is he? And the ambo said, oh, who are you? I said, I'm his oldest brother. And I think they said he's in cardiac arrest or going cardiac arrest, but the words and the way that they said it, and probably from what my mother had said to me, I had thought he was dead. I didn't think there's any possibility. Right from the start, I never thought there's any possibility he's coming back. So we're there, and it's just me and my sister, right? Because you're not having your mother come out and see that stuff, and it's something you do not want to happen. Another ambulance bus comes along, and there's 4 of them, and then there's another ambo. I think there's 5 of them, more senior person. He goes and talks to my sister, and I said, mate, look, I'm the oldest. I'm a lawyer. You talk to me. And so he starts directing things to me. And there were a couple of police as well. And so the police get there, and they start questioning, and I just went into lawyer mode. It's funny how you're so well trained, right? And I'm just walking through this, okay, so what happened? And I start walking through the facts. Well, at 1:15, I got this text. I didn't see it till 1:30. At 1:45, I was at my mother's, just walking through the day. This happened. And then, in a very chronological and factual way, in the same way you put a statement together. And I remember the police officer, I went through this, and I remember him saying, well, that was good. Can you go through it again? And I looked at him, and I was like, and I looked at his body camera, and I thought, maybe he's doing it as a distraction or keeping me calm or whatever, but I did. I went through it again. And at the same time, every now and then, Dambo, the more senior one, is coming up and letting me know what's happening. And he would have come up, and I think he came up twice, and then the third time he might have said, look, we've done the best we can. We'll give it a bit more of a shot, but there's not much else we can do. And then a short time later, he comes up and he says, look, we've done our best. But I'd had this belief that things weren't, he was dead. And that's what I had thought, and that's what happened. And I remember when the ambulance called it, they came up to me, the two who were there from the start, they were only young guys. And they come up and they were so apologetic and sympathetic and just so comforting in that moment. And I didn't feel like they owed me that at all. They didn't even have to say anything to me, but I know they would have done the best they could, and, you know, they were there. They were pumping away for 45 minutes trying to get this kid going, you know. And, they came up and I was just so grateful for the way they had respected me and him and my sister and, you know, what they were showing us. And I was grateful to the police. The police officers, I'm a fairly big guy. I'm probably 6'2" and, you know, fair size. And he was a bit bigger and stronger. And, you know, he was like, if I needed I wasn't crying then, but if I needed a shoulder to cry on, this guy was the right guy for me at the time. And as were the Ambos.
I'm so sorry about the loss of your brother. You say how you went almost automatically into that lawyer mode, which was practically, I'm sure, really useful at that time. How long did it take till that crumpled a bit and the emotion of what had happened hit you as a brother, not as a lawyer? So
he's there. My brother's there for the next 4 hours on the ground. And my sister's there, and my sister is always just so staunch and determined. She's like, I said, I want to go, so I'm not leaving him. So I am not leaving until they take him. And I was like, oh, man. And so I jumped in the car. I think I go and tell my other brother, anyway. And I was coming back to where we were, and I had a friend who was staying close, a really good friend who I'd been to school with since we were grade 10 and just done a lot of stuff over the years, and I knew he was staying down the road for Christmas. And I called him, Joel Ryan he is, and the Ryan family is always, in my family, you know, there's a lot of kids and we've got a few kids, and so we're really close as two families, I think the kids are. And he's out in the mines now. He's probably been out in the mines 20 years. He's a big guy, and they're all big, these miners. And I called him and I told him what happened. He said, mate, I'm coming. I'll come down to you. And we were so close we could walk to each other. And I remember I was walking towards him, and I was a few meters out, and that was it. The emotion came on, and he put his arms out. He's a massive guy. He put his arms out around me, and he just gave me this huge hug. And, I just cried in his shoulders. I think that was probably the first time I did. He was just there, right? He just sat there with me and my sister. He ended up taking my car and running my brother around and came back. And he then, he stayed with us until, because you have, the initial incident, and then you have forensics come out, and then you have the coroner come out. Or they come and pick up the body, the funeral home. They come out, and so it's not until the funeral home comes out and gets his body that they can take him away. So, Joel sat with us there for a couple of hours, and until his body was taken away.
It's still only such a recent thing that's happened in your family, Josh, but how's your mum doing so far?
Oh, look, it's devastated all of us. It's had a huge consequence. My mother was at the point now where over the last 20 years, she's probably spent 3 to 6 months of the year travelling around the world doing international human rights matters. And a friend of mine went over to the UN with her and said that they actually call her Mrs. UN over there. Because when the Indigenous Permanent Forum's sitting, she knows everybody, and she's been to all parts of the world. But I remember so the police give us his stuff. I think he had some thongs on and a phone. And I had his phone. I was taking it back to my mum's. This is after we all finished, and she's calling the phone, right? She knows he's gone. I think maybe she just wants to hear his voice, or she wants to check he's still alive. And that Aboriginal women, when they're really emotional, they do that wailing. It's really deep. It gets you in your soul. As I pulled up at her house, I could just hear that, and I couldn't say anything. I just walked in. I dropped his things on a table, and I just walked out. And like I say, I got a house down the back and the next street over, and I could hear her crying through the night. But it's had a fundamental shift on her and me, actually. Cara and I, we've got this approach. We're not just getting out of bed and throwing our arms over and going to work. Like, we're getting out of bed and we want to make a difference in the world. You know, we want to contribute, and that's how we've lived our life for a long time. And I was shattered. I remember that night. It was almost like this nuclear bomb had gone off in my brain. It was just the senses, I can never describe it. This huge amount of energy was just rushing through my head. And I didn't sleep that night. But all these, you know, brain was tingling, all these things happening, and this bomb, and it was just earth shattering. And so, for my mother, I mean, I think she still goes to his grave every day. That's sort of where she is at. It's hard for her to let go, and she will always blame herself. And I said to her in the days that followed, it might have been even the next day, I just said, it's not your fault. I didn't want her to feel any blame, but she will always blame herself, and I think that will be the challenge for her.
What about you, Josh? Do you feel a sense of guilt, even if logically you know that's not the case?
You know, I certainly do, and I wouldn't deny that. And I've been through grief, and I had an auntie die recently in the last couple of weeks, and that was actually comforting to experience grief in its normal form. And there are some instances like this where, unless you've ever experienced, it's really hard to explain. It can sink a ship. It can sink the Titanic. It feels so great. And Cara said to me that, you know, people can live with grief, but it's the guilt and that sense of responsibility which can really drag you down. And certainly for the first few months of this year, that's how it felt for me.
What did your wife say to you?
Well, I was just, I was on autopilot for a bit. And like I say, you know, you come from a position where you're getting up every day and you want to change the world. And it's really how I get out of bed. And I wasn't anywhere near that. I don't know if I was even in survival mode. I was just, you know, get up, get the kids to school, do what I need to do, and then pick them up and go home. But we went to the Gold Coast over the school holidays. It was the Easter school holidays. And we got back and Cara said, we can't keep doing this. You need to do something. You can't live your life like this. We can't live like this as a family. And I just wasn't in a good place during that trip. And, I just popped in my head that, I wanted to challenge myself physically and mentally. We're having this discussion. I said, I'm going to go and do Everest Base Camp. I'd never had any aspiration of doing it. I don't even know where it came up.
Josh, like, it's one thing to think I'm going to go and climb the mountain that's, you know, an hour away from my home or go camping, but Everest Base Camp.
Yeah, I guess I wanted the biggest challenge I could think of. And Are
you a mountain climber?
No, look, and I did in the 5 days lead up that I'd given myself from the time I said it and the time I was jumping on the plane. I took the dog for a walk up Balmoral Hill a couple of times, but no fitness.
This is your training. 5 days. You're telling me you booked it and 5 days later you were on a plane. So I
said it Easter Thursday or Friday. I think I went down, well, you know, there's the public holidays, but anyway, I think I paid for it on the Saturday and I was probably on the plane on the Wednesday or Thursday out.
And was she thinking this wasn't what I had in mind, beloved husband? It was.
She's like, she's typical you. You always have to go the biggest. She's like, I was thinking Tasmania for 4 days. A bit late now. I booked it. Paid.
So very quickly you find yourself in the Himalayas. What was it to be in that extraordinary environment? What impression?
It is magical up there. You know, the mountains, it's like they're their own gods, their own spirits. They've all got their own identity. And the people, you know, they've been doing their thing for probably thousands of years. There's no motors up there, right? There's no cars or anything. You're all on foot. It's like something I've never experienced, the beauty of it. I remember flying into Nepal or Kathmandu, and our plane must have went past one of the peaks, and I look out and I just see we're on level with these peaks. I remember looking out the plane window and just going, wow. And also, what have I got myself into? And about 2 minutes later, my Apple Watch starts beeping saying your heart rate's risen. I'm like, yeah, welcome to this. Get used to that for the next few weeks.
So had those couple of dog walks up Balmoral Hill prepared you for trekking in the Himalayas?
Probably not as good as it should have been, but it's more of a mental challenge than a physical. And to tell you the truth, I was there to beat myself up, Sarah. If I wanted to go and sit at a resort and, drink mocktails on next to the pool, then I could do that. But I wanted to punish myself. I wanted to make myself feel something. I wanted to hurt. And that's what I was there for. That's what I did physically and mentally.
And then did that bring its own kind of release, pushing yourself, punishing yourself that way?
Look, it did. And I remember making it to base camp, and before I left, I didn't know I didn't do any research, right? So I didn't know what was at base camp, but I thought, there's going to be something to signify base camp. I threw the Aboriginal flag in my bag, and I was like, when I get to base camp, I'm going to hold this flag up, and get a photo around whatever it was. And just turns out there's this 10, 15 ton rock there. It was, base camp sprayed on it. But I get this photo, and I didn't realize how emotional it would be getting there. And, I was there for my brother, right? I was there for my loss, for what I've gone through. It wasn't anything else. I was there to try and overcome, the emotions I'd had over the first 4 or 5 months of the year. And I get there, and I get my photo, and then I just sit down next to the rock and I start crying. And I watch everyone else lining up and getting their photos, but I'm like, that's it. All I wanted to do was to get there and to achieve that. And, hopefully it shifted where I was from. I was in such a bad place. I needed a seismic shift, and that was the biggest thing I could get. And it did give me that.
How has the trip stayed with you in the months since you've come back? It's a bit of a U-turn, I guess, from where I was. I'm not back to where I probably would have been, but I came back and I said to Cara, and Cara was sort of stuck in the mode where I was before I left. And I said, look, babe, I've changed. I'm not going to put the family through that. I'll put myself through that and come back and be the same. I'm turning things around, and I have. I've emotionally turned things around. I've been back into work a lot better. I've just been there, more present as a father. And look, don't get me wrong, I'm still having my challenges, and I don't want anyone to think that, this is going to be a short journey, but it put me onto a very different path as to where I was heading prior to it. Are there more mountains you want to climb? Where did your appetite for more of that sort of adventure? It
did. And I actually going back in March. And what is the good thing is I said to my friends, I'm going in 4 days if you want to come. But obviously none of them could come, although one came very close. So for the ones who said they put up their hand, all right, well, I'm going to go back in March. And I want to do that with a group of friends, have that experience. Hopefully there's a couple of us that will come along. But yeah, it really gave me just an emotional high and intensity, and I'm a person who likes challenges. I've had so many in my life, and challenges often keep me motivated. So to go and do that again with a group of friends and to achieve that challenge, something monumental, will be really special. Josh, thank you so much for sharing the story. I think you do deserve a few mocktails by the pool as well, though. Well, the weather's starting to warm up, so hopefully I can get a few soon. Thank you for being my guest on Conversations. Thank you, Sarah. Josh Creamer was my guest, and this conversation will be available for you shortly as a podcast. If you need to talk with someone, remember that Lifeline is always there. You can phone them on 13 11 14. I'm Sarah Kanoski. Thanks so much for listening.